This past New Year's was mine and my boyfriend's 4-year anniversary. We typically don't do much, so this year we decided to make it special by planning a romantic getaway. At the time, the two of us were living in Seattle and wanted to rent a cabin in a snowy, small town for the weekend. We found a cabin on Airbnb with a hot tub and we were sold. The cabin was, of course, the last house on the road. To get to it, you had to drive down a small, removed, private road that ended in a roundabout. Off the roundabout was a long uphill driveway leading up to the cabin. We got to the cabin and it was snowy and beautiful. The cabin itself sat on top of a garage and you needed to take stairs on the backside of the property to get to the front door. When we got inside, there was a booklet with all of the cabin's info outlined. The book said that during the snowy season, don't be surprised if their contracted snowplowers showed up to clear off the driveway. Okay, sounds good. We unpacked and realized that there was no service on either of our phones, but the booklet told us that there was a landline in the cabin if we needed anything. We spent the first night by the fire playing board games and drinking wine. The weekend was exactly what we needed. We planned to spend the next day in town, and that night, I had booked us a reservation for a nice dinner. We were gone almost all day, only returning briefly to get dressed up to enjoy some good food. Dinner was great and we were excited to head back to the cabin for some champagne hot tubbing. While at dinner, the temperature had dropped and it snowed for the first time that day, coating everything in a fresh layer of powder. We drove down the private road and got to the driveway. At that point, my boyfriend stopped the car, headlights shining in front, and asked if I noticed the new tire tracks. I looked at the driveway, hoping to quickly disregard the new tire tracks, but they were there. Immediately, we remembered that these snowplowers could have stopped by. But the issue was that we saw the tire tracks because of the snow and who plows in the dark. We also knew that once we were at the cabin, that we had no service on our cell phones. So we figured that we would head back into town and message our Airbnb host and ask them if one of their friends had stopped by the apartments. We waited for a while in town for a reply from our host but didn't hear back. We could have called, but at that point it was past 10 and we didn't want to be bad guys. We figured that we blew the whole thing out of proportion and that we might as well head back to the cabin. After all, I am a big true crime fan and I like spooky subreddits and horror movies, so I was probably just psyching myself out. My boyfriend drove us back, and this time, we actually drove up the driveway. Towards the top of the hill, the part of the driveway, I noticed something. My stomach dropped as I noticed footprints on the property. We backed on the driveway and took a closer look to see if there were more footprints. From what it looked like, someone had driven up the driveway, reversed down part, and then got out of the car and walked onto the property. Since we had now also driven on the tracks that we couldn't find where the footprints ended. The property was quite large with tons of trees and brush, and we knew that these footprints could go anywhere. The moment that we saw footprints, we decided to call the police. We figured that it was better safe than sorry. We would just have the officer go onto the property with us to check everything out. We drove back down the road until we were able to get service, called the police and waited for their arrival. A policeman showed up and we followed him onto the property. The officer scanned the property and determined that no one was out there. Obviously, we're a little shaken up and a lot embarrassed, and we thanked the officer as he left. Needless to say, neither of us wanted to sit in the hot tub in the dark woods after what had happened. Instead, we locked the doors up and watched a movie champagne-less. We were both tired from the day and we passed out pretty quickly. At 3 a.m., we both woke up on the couch with the TV on and all the lights, laughing about how the night didn't turn out as planned. As my boyfriend went to brush his teeth, we heard a noise. It sounded mechanical and it only lasted a few seconds. We looked at each other and froze. The garage door. There are very few reasons that someone would need to open the garage door of a guest-occupied Airbnb at 3 in the morning. Like I said, we woke up to all the lights on and the cabin had lots of windows. We knew that if someone was outside, they knew we were here and they could see us. I immediately grabbed the landline and I dialed 911. We sat crouched in the Airbnb, praying for the police to arrive. We knew that whoever had made those tracks were still on the property, and this time they were making noise. As I sat talking to the operator, we heard a bang in our balcony as if someone threw something up onto it. I was losing my mind when the operator told me that the police were nearby. All of a sudden, they were there. We saw the police lights and watched them search the property. Soon, we heard a banging on the door and it was the police and we were okay. At the door were 2 policemen, one in front of us and one a little behind, kind of kicking around snow and looking at the ground. I immediately noticed that the police officer in the back asked the officer that did the initial check on the property. The police officer told us that not only was the garage door shut, but it was locked. And again, there were no signs of anyone on the property. We discussed leaving, but the police officer said the road conditions were too dangerous that time of night. I looked at the police officer who had come out to the property twice, and I felt that I had deeply disappointed him. My boyfriend and I went back inside, again locking all the doors and trying to fall asleep. The next day we were leaving, and while we survived the night, I didn't feel right in the cabin anymore. It was forever the spooky cabin in my head, and I wanted to leave. As we packed up, we heard the same noise that we had heard at 3 a.m. Oh, it was the heater. A heater that sounds just like a garage that sounds lasts the same duration. My boyfriend looked at me and immediately said, "You need to give up your murder shows," and walked away. As if. As for the banging on the balcony, it was just the perfectly timed fall of a pine cone. I promise I'm not paranoid. I think back on this story a lot and I'm embarrassed about how little came of it, but I'm also incredibly grateful for the same reason. But whoever drove onto the property and walked around, thank you for triggering all of my nightmares. About a year ago, I spent a decent amount of time working in a different city than I currently live in. One day was very cold and the Airbnb that I had booked was pretty far away. I didn't have a car and had failed to pack a warm coat. I ducked into the Kmart nearby to buy something that I could wear on my walk, with the intention of returning it the following morning. My best option was this enormous XXL fuzzy bathrobe. My walk home led me through this beautiful botanic garden along a waterway. It was nearing midnight and I was halfway through my journey. I'm usually quite aware when I'm out, especially at night, but I had let my guard down a bit, due in part to the enormous bathrobe that I had wrapped around me. It was like wearing a fuzzy suit of armor. Suddenly, I felt intensely uncomfortable. I couldn't quite put my finger on what I had heard, but my immediate thought was a couple of males holding a whispered conversation. I rounded a corner and ducked into some trees, sucking my breath in and straining to understand what I was hearing. Light footsteps, voices. 2 men neared my hiding spot in the path, and I internally berated myself for not being more careful. Nobody was out, so screaming would do nothing. I'm a very small female, so this situation was one of my worst nightmares. As they passed, I heard, "She's around here somewhere." I felt physically sick, until one of the guys let out a low whistle, and I heard the jingle of a collar, a dog scurrying past my spot, and a good girl followed by smoochy noises. An intense sense of relief followed. They were talking about their beloved dog, not hunting me. They seemed harmless, endearing even. I readjusted my bathrobe to cover my head. It was that cold out, and I popped out from the trees. I didn't realize until later that I looked at myself in the mirror that the bathrobe arms were now on top of my head, sticking out like some grotesque, bulbous monster appendages. I also didn't realize that the men had stopped, or were walking very slowly, only a few meters ahead on the path. One of the men screamed in terror when they saw my emergence from the trees. The other swore loudly, and they both took off running across the bridge over the waterway, followed closely by their dog who was now barking frantically. I still have the picture that I took of myself in the mirror after the incident, and I get the giggles every time I see it. I must admit, it was a rush to finally be on the other end of a situation like this. Okay, so back when I was in the military, I was based out in California. This was pretty much right at the start of the housing bust, and I found myself newly divorced following a deployment. As such, I could no longer live on base and I had to move. I quickly discovered that it was now the same price or cheaper to rent a house instead of an apartment off base, so I got in touch with a realtor who worked with residents of a local gated community. As a newly single female with zero family in the area, I thought extra security could be a good thing. I soon found the perfect house. It was amazing. Had a wraparound porch with a view of the lake and the center of the community. Had trees blocking my views of my neighbors, and an awesome kitchen. I love cooking, and tons of local wildlife. I could easily see myself recovering from what had been an ungodly rough year. The owner mostly lived overseas, though I never really dealt with him except when I moved, but he seemed really nice, if a bit particular. He obviously loved the house, so I didn't think much of that. The 2 times that I needed something, I looked after his brother and he came to deal with them as he was a handyman of sorts. I always found it a bit weird that him and his brother looked like they could have been twins, to the point where I thought his brother was him when he came to pick up the dryer when it needed fixing. Literally, he picked it up and carried it out in his arms. The funny thing about PTSD brain, though, is that lots of normal things seem weird, while strange things seem normal. So I never really thought of the landlord-brother situation as odd until after that. Maybe it was normal and the whole oddness of what happened is setting off my paranoia, I don't really know. But yeah, landlord odd, brother was apparently the hog. Both spoke to me like I was their kid who needed very strict instructions. Anyway, I enjoyed my time in the house. My Ace pup loved it too because the next door neighbors had dogs for her to play with. But my PTSD and other mental health issues had me on a path headed straight for a medical separation. But then the president issued a series of rollback programs, a chance for military members to separate ahead of contract, in anticipation for the Middle Eastern conflicts to be abandoned. And my commander highly suggested, if you're military, you know this basically means do this or else, for me to take the early separation. There were a few reasons surrounding this, but the main was that the squadron knew they were the reason I was mentally fracked up, and there were more than a few of the people who had it in for me still at the clinic that I was assigned to. Those people kept writing me up for things that no one else got written up for. Examples of this: accidentally jamming the shredder that jammed at least once a week, leaving the front desk unattended while I was having an anaphylactic attack, having a panic attack which left work unattended because I was literally curled up into a ball in the corner. You get the picture. Of course, my brain took most of this stuff at face value and figured it was okay and that I deserved it. But my commander was trying to protect me as best as she could and get me out of a clearly hostile work environment ASAP. So I applied and I was approved for separation. Now, this meant I was leaving my lease before the year was out. I forgot if my landlord just decided to be nice or if I had to pull out a law about military members being entitled to early release from a lease when their duty assignments changed. Probably the second one because he wasn't happy. I didn't really have the mental capacity to care too much about putting him out though, because my scrambled brains all of a sudden had a lot of military paperwork and processing to deal with. Not to mention the fact that the whole idea that I was separating felt very surreal in the first place. I had always thought I would be a lifer. I didn't tell any of my neighbors that I was moving. Only one of my friends knew when exactly I was moving out. And even my movers didn't know exactly when because I stayed there on an air mattress for about a week after they had picked up my things. I was camping my way across the country on my way home, so I had a lot of stuff to move in my car too. To the best of my knowledge, no one on the base knew exactly when my house would be vacant either, because I actually stayed in a motel off base for a few days after I moved out, just to make the final days of last-minute paperwork easier. The house was about 40 minutes from my base while the motel was only 10. They knew what my travel plans. I was on separation leave for that time, which meant I was technically still in the military and they needed to know exactly where I was. But I had marked my starting location for the trip as my base and not the house. What you should be getting out of this is that only 2 people for sure knew the exact date that I was leaving the house. My friend and my landlord. He'd likely told his brother and his realtor as well, but I'm not sure. That said, even my landlord didn't know the exact date that I would be leaving the area, just when I would vacate the premises. My landlord had told me to drop my house keys in the realtor's mailbox, so that's what I did. And a few days later, I left on my road trip home. Now about a day later, I got a phone call from my landlord. I'm on the road with my pup when I answer. The conversation follows. Hey, you left your camera here. Are you sure? Yeah, it's a Nikon with a nice set of lenses and a camera bag. Oh, I don't have one of those. Really? My brother said you did. I try to think back and remember his brother coming over to drop off the dryer while my sister and nephew were in town. She's an avid photographer and I figured she must have had the camera bag out in preparation for our day trip to San Francisco. No, I only use one of those Canons that can fit in your pocket. He must be thinking of my sister's, but she for sure brought that home with her months ago. The landlord is silent for a while before. Well, what about this sleeping bag that's here? No, I definitely have my sleeping bag. Again, the landlord described my sleeping bag. No, I have mine. I slept in it last night. Well, there's a backpack too with a few random items. His tone then changed to accusatory. Did you tell one of your friends you could stay here for the rest of your lease? No. Only one of my friends even knows exactly when I moved out, and he's visiting his wife who is deployed in Korea right now. Well, someone's been living here. At this point, it should have occurred to me how weird it was that he'd gone from friendly, "Hey, you forgot this," to angry, "You let someone squat here so quickly." But it was only just getting through my head that someone had clearly moved in the moment that I moved out. This house didn't have an attic, so this couldn't have been one of those. Someone was living in the attic while I was living there, and moved down into the house after I left. There wasn't a sealed off part of the house where this could be done, and I even went into the basement on a regular basis. It's possible that someone was living in the woods behind the house, but I have no idea. Anyway, my landlord wanted me to come over and check this stuff to make sure that it wasn't mine. I told him that I'd finished up my paperwork, so I was on the road and already in Oregon. He clearly hadn't expected me to already have left the area since I still had a few days on my lease. Yeah, looking back, it should have struck me as weird that he was already in the house, but I figured he had picked up the keys and knew that I was out, and told me that he would have to call me back after he figured things out. He never called back. I texted him later to follow up, but all I got were short or no responses to my questions. No, they didn't know whose stuff it was. No answer when I told him I was freaked out and wanted to know what had happened. Yeah, he had gotten both sets of keys from the realtor, and no, he hadn't found anything else. Not long after I got my full deposit back, which I hadn't been expecting since I felt bad for not staying my whole lease. I hadn't planned on asking for it. It wasn't until relaying this all to my mom later that I realized exactly how weird this whole thing was, or what my landlord might have been making up the squatter. She pointed out how strange it was that a guy who was supposedly traveling too much to use his own house would show up himself to walk through the house after I left, especially since his brother did everything while I lived there. Neither of us are really sure if he was up to something, or if there really had been some extremely creepy stalker or squatter situation. Either way, the whole thing seriously messed with my already messed up head.